The scientific name Hippiastrum, the first part, hippie, is referring to horses, and astrum to star. If you look at the center of the flower, and this is typical of most of the Hippiastrums, there's a big green star, like the star on the forehead of a horse. So horse star would be a derivation of Hippiastrum. We go back a long ways. My best friend from college gave this to me when, or a bulb probably when I was in college, which will be 42 years ago that I graduated college. You might think this is an awful little bit of this to have after 42 years. Well, I have another big pot and about 20 little pots waiting to go to live with other people at this point. But I've also, given away tons over the years. And someone this morning who adopted a pot of it asked me about its care, and all the garbage you're told about that you have to do with amaryllis when you bring them inside in the fall, that's all a bunch of lies. The only thing you need to do to get an amaryllis to bloom is to grow it really well in the summer. The more foliage it makes, the more flowers it'll have. So it doesn't matter what you do with it once you bring in, but inside in the fall, but if you grow it really well in the summer, mine are outside in full sun, generally watered once a day because they get dry out that fast. And I put a good time-release fertilizer in the soil that feeds them all summer long. So they do not need to be dried off, they don't need to be put in the closet. You just bring them inside, and if you've grown them really well over the summer, they will bloom.
Do you usually leave them potted up in the summer, or?
Yeah, I leave mine potted up in the summer. I know some people do plant them in the ground, and most of the common amaryllis are winter hardy. This one is not. I tried it one winter, and even before the worst of winter had settled in, and this was, more than 30 years ago when we had winters. The bulbs are already deteriorating from having frozen, so it's not winter hardy at all. But any of the ones you buy in a garden center are generally winter hardy if they're planted in the ground. More than enough about this. On to the subject of the tour today. Every gardener has been told when you're visiting somebody else's garden, you should have seen it last week, or you should have seen it whenever. I hope you all visited the Arboretum in first half of January. I have never seen so much in bloom in the winter as then. And people ask, is it normal for so much to bloom? Well, all the things that are blooming now are things that tend to bloom whenever there's a mild spell in the winter. But if we can describe anything as a typical winter, there's a mild spell, things will come out, it'll get cold again, the open flowers will be destroyed, but all the buds that were not yet open will wait for the next mild spell and open up again. So normally things like the flowering apricots and stuff will bloom on and off all winter. This year with the 2-3 weeks of warmer than usual weather, some of them bloom from beginning to end already. So there's a lot less in bloom today than there was several weeks ago. We'll see more than enough for this tour, but it's nothing like it was weeks ago. This is a big crowd, and we're going to go through some tight spaces, so we'll do the best that we can. Head up this way. Hellebores, of course, this is the season of the Christmas rose and the Lenten rose. Later on, we'll see examples of the true Christmas rose. Nowadays, there's so much breeding work going on with hellebores, and I don't remember what the general name there's a range of hybrids, a group of hybrids, and this is an example of one. This is Anna's red. There's Penny's pink was the first one they introduced. Now they're introducing a whole range of them, like Dana's Dulcet and Glenda's Gleam. They're all real clever names like that. The two I have the most experience with are Penny's Pink and Anna's Red, and I think the reason why they introduced them first is because they're the prettiest of the lot. The others, some of the others that I've seen are more like an inferior Lenten Rose, where it's sort of like raw liver red with some green bile on the outside, sort of these, not so lovely color combinations. But one of the really big assets of them, I hope you can all see it, is it's good I'm not a real short person. This would never work. I'd have to have it in my sock or something like that. Notice the foliage. The foliage is spectacular, or at least really, really pretty. And these are evergreen, and they don't have as much foliage as the Lenten roses, but they do eventually cover the ground with their foliage. They are hybrids between a number of different species, and there's only one species of hellebore that's not winter hardy in our area, and that's Hellebores Liberties. And Liberties has a green foliage with this beautiful lighter veining through the leaf, and that's what shows up in these hybrid offspring of them. Now, these are sterile. Gerald, you need to get by? You can get by. Yeah, Gerald and Juan needs to catch the bus now that he's done.
Come forward.
Here. Thanks for your help today, Juan. See you Thursday. These hybrids are sterile, by which I mean they do not make seed. You know, when you cross different species, you end up with what's known as a mule, because a mule is sterile. And from a maintenance standpoint, that means you're not dealing with carpets of seedlings underneath the plants. And I think that is an asset, unless your goal is to carpet your garden with seedlings of hellebores. Any questions on this?
Did you cut the old foliage off?
Fine.
I would only cut the old foliage off of these if it looked unsightly. Well, I might as well talk about that now. Well, no, we have a huge mass of Lenten roses over here, and I'll sort of answer that question more fully when we get there. There is a little bit of foliage.
I don't think the cord's gonna reach, Doug. There's a little bit of cyclamen heterofolium foliage here, and behind you all is a whole bunch of the same species but with silver leaves. I point that out just as a reference because cyclamen heterofolium is fall blooming, so it's not really something we're going to focus on today, though the foliage is beautiful now. But we'll see a few other, or at least one other species of cyclamen in bloom today. Any questions before we move on? We're going to head up this way here.
Doug, I see the ling is in full bloom.
It is.
Yes. I'm not going to get in there, but I
No. Well, I might step over there and pick a flower.
Mine is too in Charlotte.
Oh, okay. Asarum is a genus that's sometimes called wild ginger. It is not at all related to, the culinary ginger or the ginger lilies. It's more closely related to butterfly weed. And some of them are deciduous. A lot of the evergreen ones are beautiful foliage plants year-round. The flowers are under the foliage. Oh my goodness, yes, there's a whole, it's sort of like a hen sitting on her chicks. Let me see if I can pull out oh, they're real tight in there. But if you part the foliage, you can see these. Now these flowers, and they're down at ground level. They're often pollinated by slugs and other little creatures that are crawling along on the ground. It doesn't have a pronounced foliage, and the cultivar is Ling Ling. I wonder, wasn't there a panda named Ling Ling?
Yeah.
So this black and white, almost black and white color of the flowers probably made them think of a panda bear. Fascinating flowers. Okay.
despite everything being blooming early, it doesn't seem to be bringing out the witch hazels any earlier than usual. But this particular selection of witch hazel, Amamelis mollis, is one called Wisley Supreme. And if I did these Plantsman's Walk once a month all winter long, I could stand here and point it out, because if I planted just one witch hazel, it would be this one, because it just blooms for months and months and months. It's already been blooming for at least 2 months. There are a few other witch hazels in bloom that we'll see today, but this one is just amazing. We need a better plant of it. It got, someone drove over it in their car before this fence was here, and they came in and hasn't ever fully recovered from that.
Really?
Yeah, that's what Tim says. Oh, one of my favorite hellebore. This is the most distinctive hellebore in the genus Hellebore. Most of them, sort of have the growth habit of the Lenten Rose and the Christmas Rose. This is Hellebores fetidus, fetidus meaning fetid or stinking. People sometimes call it the stinking hellebore. And I can tell by everybody's wrinkled noses that you're just being overpowered by the fetidness of this species. I'm being sarcastic. Because if you touch the plant, and I'll grab a couple seedlings, there is sort of an acrid smell to the plant, sort of like if you've ever grown lettuce and it's bolted and it's gotten really bitter. It's that sort of acrid smell. But it's in full bloom. So these little green flowers, often with a little burgundy edge to the petals, don't get bigger. But it's this beautiful architecture. It has the stem, whereas Lenten Rose and Christmas Rose, the flower stalks arise from the crown of the plant, from the ground level. But this has this beautiful architecture of the hand-like leaves, and then this candelabra of little green flowers. And long before it's in bloom, you have all these pale green bracts nestled in amongst the dark foliage, and on a gray winter day, that light sort of lime green really shines in the garden. It is a short-lived hellebore. Most hellebores you plant, and they're going to be there. Your great-grandchildren will be able to come and see them. It might bloom really well for a year or two, but you see, it produces a few seedlings. Again, sarcasm. But they transplant real readily. And you can, I'm just going to just pull out a seedling. So this is pretty good seedling. And you would dig it up and not pull it out if you want to be successful in transplanting. But if you were to dig this up and plant it where you want it, a year from now it would be in bloom, because they come on that quickly. Their lifestyle is more live fast, die young, whereas the other hellebores are, slow and steady. Any questions on that?
Is there a label on these?
Probably. Hellebores fetidus. You can ignore the cultivar name Piccadilly. There was a nursery in Georgia, Piccadilly Farm, and it's their seed strain. It's not really a cultivar, and it doesn't look any different to me than the Hellebores fetidus I've known for 40 years. Here's another example of a modern hybrid hellebore. This sort of sounds like one of those, and never mind, I've lost that train of thought. This is one called Shooting Star. Again, you see a little bit of that modeling in the pale veining in the leaf. Hellebores, you plant, you can leave them alone for the rest of all time. Right here we do see a cyclamen that's blooming. This is cyclamen coum. Cyclamen coum is, if I grew only one cyclamen, it would be the one I would grow, because they generally start blooming about December and then bloom all winter long. This pale one is not the typical color. The typical color is closer to magenta, a color that really stands out in the garden. They can also be white. The foliage the plant is much smaller growing than cyclamen heterofolium, because the cyclamen heterofolium, when it's well established, will cover about this much territory. Now, you probably at some point have been told that snowdrops do not grow well in this area. Well, if you buy dried up bulbs in a garden center in the fall, they probably won't grow. But if you get a start of one in growth, or as the English like to say, transplant them in the green, meaning while they're in active growth, most snowdrops do really well. This is the little common snowdrop. I didn't give it that common name. This is Galantis and Nopales. It's a small thing, but it multiplies real quickly. I think it's in this area behind some of you is a snowdrop with green foliage. That's Galantis warrenoii. And then also on that mound is a hellebore that looks a lot like a Lenten Rose. It's which one is that? Oh, that's it's an Italian species, Hellebores. Oh, somebody, Ligoricus. Yeah, Ligoricus. Yes, thank you. And this Lenten roses, you know, 30 years ago we called them Hellebores orientalis, which is a wild species, and that is their most important parent. But the modern Lenten roses are called Hellebores hybridis because they're a hybrid between a number of different closely related species, all with that same growth habit. But in the modern Lenten roses, you have a much wider range of colors, you know, yellows and slaty grays and blacks and colors like that. And that comes from introducing other wild relatives into those hybrids. When we take a few more steps, you'll see a beautiful, beautiful mass of a snowdrop, one called Magnet. It's an older variety. And you know, nowadays there are hundreds of different snowdrops available. I don't think, you know, even the people who are pretty serious about snowdrops sometimes say, well, they're just little white flowers with green bits to them. And I don't feel a need to have a complete collection of snowdrops. If I just have something that multiplies real freely, like that one there, then I can have a big mass of it before too long. All right, we'll take a few more steps that way.
You know any garden centers around here that actually sell the plants instead of the bulbs?
The question was, do I know of any garden centers who sell snowdrop plants instead of bulbs? I do not, and that's probably more a reflection that I'm not let out of the house very often. Do you know Pine Nut Nursery up in Clarksville? Well, and you mustn't have come to John Lonsdale lecture 2 weeks ago. I'm not admonishing you for coming, but John Lonsdale is a nurseryman from southeastern Pennsylvania, and he travels around selling his cyclamen and snowdrops and other stuff. And he'll be up at the Pine Nut Farms Hellebore open weekends. Well, they're Fridays and Saturdays. The last 2 in February and the first 2 in March. And he'll have his snowdrops and cyclamen and other little treasures.
I just have a question for you about this evergreen, the spiny evergreen. It has this insect on it. I had the same one. What I did, I didn't know what to do. I just cut off all the leaves on every upper medium in the area and hit it with floral this week. Was that the right thing?
I'm not aware of whatever insect you're talking about.
It's on the underside of the leaves.
Yeah, I'll look at the insect some other time. Yeah, we'll move.
I think Marilyn had a question.
There's a nursery, a mail order nursery that does sell them in the green and not very expensive, because a lot of John Lonsdale's, these wonderful ones, but a lot of them are the expensive varieties. But Carolyn's Gardens, I think it's called, she's out of New Jersey. She sells most of her plants retail local, but the snowdrops she does sell by mail order.
Okay, is that still on? I'll repeat that because probably a lot of you didn't hear that. Marilyn was recommending a mail-order nursery based in New Jersey called Carolyn's Garden.
I think so.
Well, and you know, if you just Google, you know, Galantis or Snowdrops, I'm sure you'll come up with a bunch of nurseries. But she sells Snowdrops mail order, and Marilyn is recommending her moderate prices because some of the fancy, you know, I'm an idiot and I've spent like $45 for a Snowdrop bulb, and maybe even more. They're still alive though. Is the spruce, you know, beyond these two deciduous plants, it's eventually a very large spruce, but it's really slow, which is part of the reason why it's probably part of the reason why it's not widely available in the nursery trade. If you went almost straight here to the far end of the parking lot, the ground slopes off, and up against the fence are two other plants of it that are much larger. Unfortunately, in that location, we're going to have to remove them because they're under power lines. But it's a beautiful dark green, slightly glossy needles, and the branches have this wonderful swooping growth habit. You know, you can all step that way later on and look at them. All right, I thought we would talk about camellias since we're here. You know, the camellias in the wild, and we'll see some examples of wild Camellia japonica. Camellia japonica is the most widely spread of the 200 or 300 species of wild camellias, all of which are Asian. Camellia japonica, despite its name, Japonica meaning from Japan, occurs in Japan and Korea and China. And in the wild, it's generally just a small 5-petaled flower, but in Asia they've been cultivated for many, many centuries, and there's all sorts of garden forms. You know, this red one is it's a common old one, and it's Professor Sargent. Often people used Professor Charles Sargent, but I think its correct name is just Professor Sargent. Now, Mr. Sargent was I think the original founder director of the Arnold Arboretum outside of Boston. So a significant American horticulturist. And the white one is one with the silly name of White by the Gate. And there are two different examples of flower form. I'll just, you know, this one with the big pom-pom center is known as an anemone form, and then this one with the concentric series of petals is known as a formal form. But too much information, but forgive me. I used to work for the American Camellia Society. Now, people often ask, when do I prune my camellias? Or how do I prune my camellias? Well, camellias do not need to be pruned. They are trees. Some of them are sort of maybe shrub size, but I define a tree as something that has permanent stems, and camellias have permanent stems. Now, something like this forsythia benefits from yearly renewal pruning, where you go in and cut out some of the oldest growth to encourage the production of new growth. Well, that's okay with a plant who has that life cycle, but camellias are trees; those trunks are permanent. So provided you've planted it in a location where it has enough room to grow to full size, you don't really need to do any pruning on them at all. If you need to keep it smaller, you can prune them as hard as you want, because, you know, back in 83 or 84, when we went from 70 to 5 degrees in one day's time on Christmas Eve, a lot of camellias in this area died to the ground and regrew. So you know, if you have to keep them smaller, fine, prune them, but otherwise they don't need regular pruning. Any questions on that? We'll see some other examples of camellias as we go on this walk today. Oh Lord, one of the best, not best, but really beautiful winter flowering plant, the Edgeworthia paper bush. No, there's one of those scary scientific names again, Edgeworthia. But if you lower your panic level and just think of the word, it's named after somebody named Edgeworth. So many scientific names are just people's names, so don't panic. And this one is Edgeworthia chrysantha, which means golden flower. Antha is flower. The other related species that is just like a smaller version of this is Papyrifera, which means to bear paper. The pithy inside of the stem is used to make a very fine grade paper. We just grow it for its winter flowers. Now they're not giving a good display this year. I think it was the going down to the mid-20s in November, mid-November, when the buds probably weren't fully hardened off. The one in the lath house shed all of its buds before they even opened. But half the beauty of the plant all winter long are these flower buds when they're still tight. They're real silvery, so they look like little silver ornaments on the bare branches. It is a Daphne relative. This species is fairly long-lived. The other species I mentioned, the Edgeworthia papyrifera, is probably not quite as long-lived as Daphne odora. So, in other words, it comes and goes fairly quickly. But this one is reliable.
So is it going to recover now this year, or is this what it is?
The question was, is this going to recover this year?
It means the beautiful blossoms.
No, the flower buds are made once a year. So the fact that they were lost in November, they're not going to create more buds and bloom at this time of the year. Probably all winter blooming and probably most early spring blooming plants make their flower buds in the fall or late summer the year before, which is why if you go in and chop, you wake up on Saturday morning and you think, oh gosh, I need to go out and chop on something. If you go out and chop your bushes back in the fall, and it's something that normally blooms in the winter or the spring, you're cutting all those flower buds off. So no, they only make those flower buds once a year. Some of you probably can't see this from where you are, but as we move on from here, you'll get a chance to see it. This is, if I'm going to try to convince you to grow something, I should be standing in front of a spectacular specimen of Erica, one of the heaths. I don't think we want to walk all the way down to the southwest corner of the Arboretum to see one that looks perfect. So we'll make do with this. The heaths and heathers comprise two different genera being the plural genus. The heathers are Caluna. They generally are not happy here. The ericas, the heaths, actually are do very well with us if we provide them with good drainage. I think at times when we have a wet spell, this spot might be a little bit too wet for it, but they bloom all winter long, and they can be quite long-lived because in the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden in Charlotte, there's one that I rooted recently last summer, and that was a plant Elizabeth Lawrence planted in that garden. I don't know if we know when she planted it, but she died in 1985, so it's been there at least that long. And there are quite a few different selections available. The color range is white to pale pink through darker pink, but they are a little subshrub, and like rosemary and lavender, they benefit from being cut back periodically to generate. Well, and we also need to spend some time cleaning it up, but maybe a year from now it'll look a lot better because we will have fussed over it. But if you have a sunny, well-drained spot, it's a sweet little shrub. The flora of China is tremendously diverse, whereas in North America we just have a small number of magnolia species. In China there are, huge numbers of magnolias, both evergreen and deciduous. Here and there and some over that corner are examples of some of the evergreen magnolias from China. Maudier is one of them. I don't know all their names. And a lot of them are fairly similar, you know, evergreen foliage, white flowers, but they start blooming in early winter, get clobbered by a cold spell, but then will start blooming again. They have a slight fragrance, not necessarily a fragrance you would, you know, grow the plant solely for its fragrance, but it's pleasant. We've got two different camellias, both really good dewars. This is one called Cinnamon Cindy. It has the cinnamon part because it is fragrant. Now most people don't think of fragrance when they think of camellias, but in the, you know, in the 200 to 300 different species of wild camellias, there are a number of species that are fragrant. One of them is Camellia luchuensis, which is a Japanese species that has tiny white flowers that are very fragrant. Now I can go in the arboretum and cut stems, but you can't. It has a fragrance. It's not my favorite fragrance, but it is fragrant, so at least it's not making a liar of me today. If you'll pass that around. And there's a sport of Cinnamon Cindy that has a single flower called Cinnamon Sensation. Now that was bred by the late Dr. William Ackerman, who was working at the National Arboretum in DC. And the focus of his breeding was to breed fragrant camellias. That was up until the big freeze in 1983 or 84 when the director of the Arboretum said, your research is now being switched to breeding winter hardy camellias. So he bred all those Sasanqua-like hybrids in the winter series, like Winter Star, Winter Snowman, that are fall blooming camellias that are, you know, supposedly hardy into zone 6, or at least more reliably winter hardy in a cold end of zone 7. Now this big guy, or I guess I should say gal because it's Mary Christian, is a Williamsii hybrid. Camellia X Williamsii, and the X indicating it's an interspecific hybrid, is a hybrid between Camellia Japonica and Camellia Camellia Sinensis, which is referring to the Salween River in China. It always manages to bloom real nicely for many weeks, maybe even several months. And there's a variegated sport of Mary Christian called Golden Spangles. That's a real pretty foliage plant that I'll try to remember to point out when we go past the winter garden. And you can see, you know, if you keep in mind that most camellias eventually get really large, you might site them more in a more sensible location, like not under your picture window, but maybe between your house and something you want to screen. Camellia Japonica is pretty slow growing, but you know, a lot of these hybrids are faster growing than Japonica.
How old is that one about?
I looked at the back of the label because often we have the accession number on the back of the label, and most of you by now are familiar with our accession numbers. Each new thing arriving here at the Arboretum gets a unique accession number, and the first 2 digits always refer to the year. And that wouldn't necessarily be the year it was planted, but the year it arrived at the Arboretum. Do you remember when there was a metal frame, a metal building here, and they cured sweet potatoes in the fall in it? And part of that building or another building was the Arboretum office, you know, 40 years ago. This dates back to about that time, so I'm guessing it's probably been in the ground at least 30 years. Okay. Now with 2 of the camellias today, there was an X between the generic name and the specific epithet, the 2 parts of a plant's name. Well, when the X is between those 2, it indicates
that, well, like Camellia X Williamsii is a hybrid between two species of Camellia. But on this one, you see the X comes before the generic name. It's X psychoparodia, has nothing to do with being psychotic. And that indicates that it was a hybrid between two genera. So this is a hybrid between Parodia, which is the Japanese ironwood, and Psychopsis, which is a close relative. And it's Psychopyrodia semi-decidua, meaning it's semi-deciduous, or which I guess would be the same as semi-evergreen. Whereas Parodia is fully deciduous, Psychopsis is fully evergreen, and this one can't make up its mind. But it is in full bloom. It's a witch hazel relative, and it is less showy than a witch hazel, but you see the flowers consist of mostly male anthers dangling down from the flowers. When they first start to open, they're reddish, so they're a little bit more colorful. You can see a few young flowers here and there that are still reddish, but they become really handsome trees with multiple trunks and gnarly stems. This is the hellebore that is properly known as the Christmas rose. Why rose, I don't know, but Christmas because it often does start blooming before Christmas. Almost always the flowers are pure white when they open. As they age, they do become a little bit pinkish. The things we think of as petals on hellebores, and hellebores are in the buttercup family, the ranunculus family. In that family, things like hellebores and clematis, what look like petals are usually sepals, and so the tendency to turn green as they age is real common. If you look in the center of the fresh hellebore flowers, I'm going to pick one. Let me see. That's a better example. I'm not sure I need my reading glasses. Yeah, in the center of a hellebore flower, below the yellow stamens, are these little yellowy green nectaries, and nectaries, of course, are holding nectar to entice the pollinators to visit the flower. And the sepals serve the role of the petals, but the petals become the little nectaries. More botany than you cared to know, right? But if you grow the Christmas rose from seed, individuals will bloom at different times. Like if you have one that always blooms before Christmas, it'll probably always maintain that habit. But if you end up with seedlings that don't bloom until late January, they will probably always be that way. So it's nice to get ones that bloom early.
So
now,
if it blooms late, you can't make it.
no, I don't think you can change its mind.
I'm disappointed every year.
Okay, yeah, you'll be disappointed by it every year. Now, the Christmas rose is Hellebores niger, and niger is referring to black, which seems a little odd for a plant with white flowers, but it's because the roots are black. And in medieval times, it was thought that if you ingested hellebores, it would make you invisible. Well, it'd probably kill you, and then you'd soon be visible, because many members of that family are poisonous. Those of you noticing the fragrance in here, it's from the winter Daphne. Daphne, most people pronounce it odora. I'm not saying most people say odora, I guess because they adore the plant. I always say odora because it's referring to the odor of the plant, but I'm probably incorrect. I've worked with somebody who called them suicide plants because they do, grow perfectly well for 6, 8, 10, 12 years, and then one day they get a notion in their head that today's the day to die, so by the next day they're completely dead. But don't ever let that stop you from planting one, because that fragrance is amazing. to my mind, is as good as having dessert. Here's a really odd
There's
Daphne.
an alternative duck. You can just lose your hair completely.
Yeah. I thought about doing that yet last night. This little Daphne, maybe more of a curiosity than anything, because it is deciduous in the middle of the summer. So if you didn't know that was its normal growth habit, you'd probably rip it out at that point. But it loses its leaves in the summer for, maybe about midsummer, and then doesn't have leaves again until the fall. It is blooming now with little yellowy flowers. I don't think there's any fragrance to them. And I think, here's its label. Daphne pseudomeserium. Daphne meserium is another species of Daphne, so someone is telling you this is the false Daphne meserium. And I'll only point this out because it's another camellia, but anybody have iced tea for lunch? This is the camellia from which all that iced tea is made. Camellia Sinensis. Okay, we all know not Daphne, camellias have huge flowers, but there are lots of species with tiny flowers, and this one hasn't managed to open a flower today, not yet, but it's Daphne, I'm not sure how you pronounce T-S-A-I. I guess it's a double I, yeah, double I. But that was Mr. Tsai's family name, T-S-A-I. He was a Chinese botanist who discovered this. It's native to Yunnan, China, and Myanmar and northern Vietnam. But the little buds are pretty, little, sort of like little red pearls. When it's open, the flower is mostly pure white, but it's a delicate, graceful plant. And it's been in this location for quite a few years. It didn't suffer too badly. What is it now? 2 winters ago, where we turned so cold for several weeks. So reliably winter hardy here. Eventually a lot taller than this. We had to cut away some of this toria that was sitting on top of it. And then we're going to look at this lavender flower Daphne. This is our third Daphne of the tour. This is Daphne genkwa, Genkwa. Haven't a clue what that means, which means I need to look it up. It's a deciduous species, as you can very well tell. I think it's sometimes called the Lilac Daphne because it does look a lot like the common lilac, but I don't think it has any fragrance, so everybody's nose is a little bit different. Just one long period of bloom early in the, late winter, or whatever time of year it is, I don't know anymore. I would say this is about full size for the plant. Any questions on that? What? Are you're wondering what this is? All right, there was a question about this evergreen plant below it. This is one of the evergreen Solomon seal. They look very much like Solomon seal with the little white bells underneath at each leaf axil. But it is evergreen, so a nice feature to the plant.
Will it grow outside the lighthouse?
Oh, the question was, will it grow outside the lath house? It does not need the cosseting that it gets in here. We have it in many places in the Arboretum, and without any care at all, it's just a permanent plant in the garden. The Solomon seals are polygonatum. This is not in that same genus, it's Disporopsis, but very closely related to the Solomon seal. And here's its label. I like labels because then I don't have to stand here. Oh, sure. I'll put it on the edge of the bed. But here. All right, just put it back when you're done. Don't do this at home. This is one of the wild species of Hellebores closely related to the Lenten Rose. You see it has the same growth habit as the Lenten Rose, and it's one of 5 or 6 or 7 or more green-flowered wild hellebores. And some of them are so similar that the hellebore experts say
you can't be sure what you have unless you know where it came from in the wild. Things are that similar in my mind, I have to wonder, well, maybe they're the same. But I'm not a hellebore expert. But this is Hellebores viridis meaning green. And I don't know, I think they're pretty little green flowers in the wintertime. It's a lively green, but they're all easy.
Is that,
Yes.
was it a different one that you said was not hardy here?
Yeah, that's lividus.
Lividus.
Yeah, lividus referring to lead, because of the sort of gray-green foliage, I imagine. Yeah. You would think I'd be better at juggling two things since I own 3 dogs and walk 3 dogs and haven't ever convinced my doctor to graft me a 3rd arm. We met another evergreen Chinese magnolia back there a little ways. This is a hybrid magnolia, one called Eternal Spring. It was bred by Dr. Clifford Parks, who, along with his late wife, Kaime Parks, started Camellia Forest Nursery in Chapel Hill, which is an ongoing enterprise. Their son David continues to run it. And this has quite a nice fragrance, but it also, you know, as you might guess with the name Eternal Spring, does bloom for a fairly extended period of time. Pass this around if anybody wants to smell it. I think in time it'll be a lot larger plant than it is now. Do I need to talk about our superhighway here? Okay. We often need to bring in large trucks for various events here, like the food trucks that we have at Moonlight and at the spring plant sale. And in wet spells, that lawn area out there will not support a large truck. And so we are building this new superhighway, or otherwise known as the garden path, that will support a food truck or other large trucks so we can bring them in here for events. Or there's also times when we might need to bring in a dump truck of gravel or something for, you know, some other part of the Arboretum. So it just gives us a lot better access through the Arboretum. We're creating these new beds here, and I hope before probably before next month's Plantsman's Tour, you'll see a lot of new plantings around the road. Any questions on that? Anybody totally appalled by that? I hope not. And speaking of the event, I just remembered one thing I meant to mention earlier. I don't know if you all know that the Arboretum sells used garden books. We are so overstocked right now. I would love if everybody would go in and buy in a few, because we have like 7 more boxes of books that were recently donated to go out there. And they're $5 each. Some of them are just $1 each, and you find all sorts of good old classics. And they're in the visitor center. I mentioned earlier that when we were standing in front of those big fancy forms of Camellia Japonica, that the wild Camellia Japonica has a small, usually 5-petaled flower. Well, this is a wild Camellia Japonica. Years ago, JC and others collected seed from a wild population of Camellia Japonica on an island in the northernmost part of South Korea. Very, very cold place, probably the coldest location for a natural population of Camellia Japonica. And so these are ones that have been used in breeding for cold hardiness in some of the hybrids. But that's a wild camellia. It's sort of amazing that from this you can end up with one of those huge flowers like we saw earlier. And typically, Camellia Japonica we don't grow in full sun. Notice that instead of being a really dark green, it's sort of a yellow green. I think that's just a reaction to being in full sun. Now, I think gardeners often overdo the shade thing with camellias and they end up with scrawny plants without much bloom. So maybe full sun isn't the best location for Camellia Japonica, but I wouldn't put it in heavy shade where it never sees the sun at all. And the other thing I need to add is that not all camellias want the same amount of shade. Camellia Sinensis, the fall blooming one, the more sun you give it, the more it's going to bloom and the fuller the plant's going to grow. Nothing sadder than a Camellia Sinensis in heavy shade where it's super scrawny and manages to produce 5 flowers or something ridiculous like that. Now, yeah, I see a honeybee. I was just looking for honeybees. The honeybees, I'm surprised there's not more out on this because, one, honeybees are native to the old world, and so probably new Camellia Japonica, and the flowers are offering, I don't know how much nectar they offer to the honeybees, but there's certainly tons of pollen in there. This is an example of a wallflower. These seed heads here are not part of the wallflower. This is ironweed, I think. The wallflower with the, what color is that? Sort of purpley violet flowers. This is a very old cultivar called Bowles Mauve. Whatever color mauve is, you'll have to ask an English gardener what color mauve is. It will bloom now for another 3-4 months. It is sterile, so it cannot be raised from seed. So it's propagated by stem cuttings. The plant is not long-lived, but the cultivar is probably 100 years old, so you keep it going by starting new plants from stem cuttings periodically. Most other wallflowers are grown from seed, and they are generally really good, late winter into spring blooming plants. These snowdrops are largely done blooming. You see a whole lot of foliage where there are no more flowers. I just wanted to point out this is another species of snowdrop, a wild species, Galantis elwisii, named after an Englishman who brought it back from, I think maybe the Caucasus during he was a soldier in World War I. And his family name is Elwes, E-L-W-E-S. So I know his widow once complained that people were pronouncing this snowdrop Galantis elwisii, and he says, we're not sick, we're not wheezing, it's Elwes. Anyhow, just another example that snowdrops do well in this area. What? The question was, do moles and voles eat snowdrops? I have no experience of them having done that. They are the same family as daffodils, the amaryllis family, and I've never known, moles are insectivores, so they don't eat plants, but voles, which are just a fat, short-tailed mouse, that's exactly what they are. They have a different name, but they're just another species of mouse. They're built sort of like a hamster. Voles do eat a lot of plants, but I don't think they would ever eat a snowdrop. Someone's going to say they eat them in my garden. Right? Really?
I had red.
Okay. Now, voles are awful. They'll eat the roots off of woody plants. Most of the fancy, showy witch hazels we find for sale in garden centers are either Asian species or hybrids between several Asian species. But there are 3 species of witch hazels native to North America. One is Camellia virginiana, referring to the state of or territory of Virginia, though it's very much wider spread than that. The other one is the Ozark witch hazel, which is Camellia vernalis, vernalis referring to vernal. I'm forgetting whether that is winter or spring. Someone help me. And spring? Okay. And this is a dwarf form of Camellia vernalis, the Ozark witch hazel, called Quasimodo, and probably exhibiting its normal adult size. This plant back here, that shows you how big the same species, Camellia vernalis, typically gets. normally would be a lot fuller. It's for one reason or another in decline, but and it's quite fragrant. I'm not getting much fragrance on it today. It's almost like the witch hazels aren't enjoying this mild winter. It's like they want some cold before springtime. There we go. The small tree with the yellow flowers. There are two. That is a true dogwood. Dogwoods are cornus, and most species of cornus do not have the big white bract, what we often think of as petals of the common Cornus florida, the dogwood we all know. Most of them lack that. So if you think of a flowering dogwood's typical flower, it's those little yellow things in the center of those 4 white bracts that are the true flowers. So most cornus in bloom look more like that, where it's just a cluster of tiny yellow flowers. There is a European species, Cornus, Cornus mas, M-A-S, and then there's an Asian species, Cornus officinalis. Officinalis refers to something that was used in an apothecary shop. And they're pretty much indistinguishable until they get old enough to exhibit their typical bark, and then they're really distinct because I need to check. One has real shaggy bark, the other one has smooth bark that peels, so it has sort of a jigsaw pattern, a little bit like crepe myrtle does.
That one's been renamed Cornus officinalis.
Okay, then officinalis has that shaggy bark. That's one that the Arboretum introduced years ago, and they thought it was Cornus mas, but turned out to be Cornus officinalis. They're pleasant little trees with early yellow flowers. In case anybody is wondering, all these daffodils are February gold, and they date back to JC's time, so a good, persistent, and reliable performer. This is winter honeysuckle. A lot of people are surprised to find a honeysuckle that's not a vine. Well, it's probably just as common to be a self-supporting shrub than a climbing shrub in the genus Lonicera, the honeysuckle genus. And this is Lonicera fragrantissima. Another scary scientific name, but fragrantissima does sound a little bit like fragrance. Whenever you see that issima ending, that just essentially means very. So they didn't name it Lonicera fragrans, they named it Lonicera fragrantissima. And I love the plant, I wouldn't be without the plant. You do not need to put it in your most visible location, because on a mildly warm winter day, it will perfume your whole yard. You might want to put it, where the prevailing winds are going to bring the fragrance to you rather than to your neighbor's house. But I've known it to start in December and bloom all winter long. In a colder winter, it'd be mostly leafless at this time, but it's being slower about shedding its leaves because of the mild winter. It is a great big coarse shrub. If you practiced renewal pruning on it real heavily every year, you could keep it probably half this size. I'm usually not happy when plant breeders make something tall into a dumpy little plant. But I'd be happy if a plant breeder would breed a winter honeysuckle that maybe got 4 feet by 4 feet rather than, what is this? Oh, about 8 foot by 8 foot. But indestructible. Whereas the Daphne, the winter Daphne, your relationship with it's not going to be long term. This is going to outlive us all. You see it out in the country where a house has long since disappeared, but this is still alive in the woods that grew up. Yeah. It's very shade tolerant. It'll bloom quite well in places, probably all but the very darkest shade it would still bloom. Yeah. Everybody knows the purple leaf plum. Well, this is an improvement on purple leaf plum because it has the foliage of a purple leaf plum, but much showier flowers. The wild type purple leaf plum has a small, very pale, five-petaled flower. This is a hybrid between a purple leaf plum and a Prunus mume.
which it's amazing to go on this tour today and not have seen a Prunus mume yet. I was thinking, well, we're standing under one and it's done blooming, which is unimaginable for early February. But from Prunus mume, it got a bigger flower with more petals and more color, but it still has that, the beautiful purple foliage of a purple leaf plum. It's Prunus X, again, because it's a hybrid between two species, Bleriana. Not too readily found in the nursery trade, but I suspect if you're persistent, you'll find it. Any questions? Well, quick.
Is that fragrant?
It is fragrant. It's, if you're smelling something, it's it. It's not quite, to my nose and my own opinion, it's not quite as delightful a fragrance as the Prunus mume, but it's still nice.
Does this one have any fall color at all? Because the purple leaf plum doesn't really...
The question was, does this have any fall color? I don't know the answer to that, because if perhaps it does and I just wasn't around it that week or something.
And is this when it normally blooms?
Pretty much. It's probably a little bit early.
Okay.
Yeah. This isn't really well, this is a plant of winter interest, but it really doesn't bloom until, the cusp between winter and spring, if such a thing exists. This is one of the Stachyurus, an unpleasant scientific name, but it's Stachyurus himalaicus. I think you can figure out where it's from. And common name of spiketail. These are all flower buds in these pendant chains from the leaf stalk. And I just think it has a wonderful aspect all winter long. But then these will open into sort of slightly yellowy, limey green flowers. Just absolutely beautiful. Funny thing about it is that these spikes are real stiff. You sort of expect them to sort of like wiggle, but no, they're rigid, so they're more like the teeth on a comb. And earlier when we were in the Lath House, someone asked about the Evergreen Solomon seal and whether or not it would survive outside the Lath House. Yeah, here it is right here. We don't fuss over this part of the Arboretum. Just a handsome evergreen plant through the winter months. Like so many evergreen herbaceous plants, if we have the time, we'll cut this foliage away before the new growth comes up, because this old foliage only lasts a year, so it will slowly decay after the new foliage comes up. There was a question of whether we would see any of the winter blooming Algerian Iris today, and I certainly knew these plants were here but hadn't looked at them recently, so I wasn't sure what we would find, but we see quite a few splendid flowers. This is Iris unguicularis. It does typically bloom whenever there's a mild spell between Thanksgiving and March. It is fragrant, though the fragrance is not very evident. Yeah.
Can we ask some people to move on down, because there's no way anyone back here to...
Okay.
If you bring it in,
Yeah. Lindy, I'll give you a piece of the Iris unguicularis knot cut while you're here, because I promised you and Andrea started it. I have it here, so don't disappear. Yeah, we were talking about the winter blooming Iris unguicularis here. It's the Algerian Iris, and it does typically bloom whenever there's a mild spell between Thanksgiving and into March, so it's on and off all winter long. This is close to the typical color. I guess the typical color is slightly darker, but there are white ones and paler ones in this. It's tolerating this spot where it doesn't get a whole lot of hours of full sun, but typically I'd plant it out in full sun. Any questions on that? The Mahonias are mostly done. Right behind some of you is
Winter Sun, a hybrid Mahonia. Delightfully fragrant flowers, but there's a couple other Mahonias further on that are still in bloom. All right. Some people sometimes cut the foliage back on the Iris and Iris. Since the flowers are born somewhat down in the foliage, the question was, will the flowers be less protected from a frost? I'm not sure it'd make that much difference. And this foliage is fairly clean. Maybe that's one thing, out in full sun, the foliage could be maybe a little bit shabbier this time of year. These are examples of the Lenten Rose, what we used to call Hellebores orientalis and now call Hellebores hybridis. And mostly I wanted to mention about cutting away the old foliage. The plant doesn't care whether or not you cut away the old foliage. We do it only from the standpoint of improving the display. I like green in the winter garden because the garden is mostly devoid of green in the winter. But I also like to cut away any foliage that is has gotten unsightly. So I would go in and cut out leaves like that one, and they also put up some new foliage in the fall, so there's some really fresh leaves like that. But if your preference is to cut away all the foliage, that's fine. A lot of people do that. They think the flowers show up better, and they probably do. But again, as I said a moment ago, I like the green foliage, so I tend to just cut away the unsightly ones and leave anything that's still presentable. If you have very sensitive skin, you probably want to wear gloves when you do that. Any question on that? If you have a super beautiful one and you want to make more of it, they do tolerate being dug and divided. You'll need some heavy equipment to divide them because they grow from this super woody crown. You might almost need to take a saw to it, but then replant them. They'll grumble for the first year or so after you divide them, but then they'll settle back in, and then you'll have 5 clumps of your favorite one instead of just one.
What time of year for that, Doug?
Whenever you have the time to do it. But I think you'll see if you look under them, there's carpets of seedlings. The Lenten Rose is very fertile, so you get these carpets of seedlings. It's like a litter of mongrel puppies. They're all going to look different, and some are going to be just as beautiful as mom, and others probably not so. So, none of them are too ugly.
Doug, do the double ones ever come from seed double, or is just divisions?
No, they're not divisions. Almost pretty much all the named Lenten Rose type hellebores are not cultivars. They're not asexually propagated. They're seed strains. The double ones, if you collect seed from double flowered parents, the majority of seedlings will be double flowered. But like if you, I'm actually not going to use a seed strain name that I know because I'll step on somebody's toes. But let's say you had a seed strain of Lenten roses called Pam's Pink or something like that. Well, the very best examples out of that lot of puppies are going to be really beautiful pink ones, but you also might have some white ones or gray ones or something like that. So any of those seed strain, that's the thing to find out when you're buying hellebores. Is it something being produced in tissue culture, or are they grown from seed? There are a lot of really beautiful seed strains of hellebores, but I don't tend to buy them unless the plant is blooming, because then you can make sure it's an exceptional one and not just a run-of-the-mill one. You spend a lot more money that way, but at least you get what you want. All right, other questions? How are we doing for time?
Over by 13 minutes.
Oh dear.